Good evening, everyone. As our conference continues to populate electronically, I would like to welcome you to Conversations About Ethics. I am Ruth Berggren, Director of the Center for Medical Humanities and Ethics, and I'm delighted to welcome you this evening. In traumatic or stressful moments, individuals may act or witness others acting in ways that violate deeply held moral beliefs. Such moral injuries can cause great suffering. Much research has focused on military service members and veterans, but studies have identified moral injury among healthcare workers as well. This has special relevance now in this COVID pandemic, when clinicians are facing many tough ethical decisions about which patients receive care when resources are limited. We are joined tonight by Dr. Rita Nakashima-Brock, one of the nation's foremost experts on moral injury. Her presentation is the 24th Conversations About Ethics, a series that explores ethical dilemmas that influence healthcare throughout our life cycle. And I'll tell you a little bit more about Dr. Brock in just a moment. Conversations About Ethics is presented twice annually, although this year we'll have a third presentation, by the Ecumenical Center and the Center for Medical Humanities and Ethics at the UT Health Science Center, with generous support from Methodist Healthcare Ministries of South Texas. We thank our partners for their contributions and their ongoing support of this community and of this event. Now, before I get started, I do have a few housekeeping details. Dr. Brock and the Planning Committee have no relevant financial relationships with any commercial interests related to this activity. Those who are seeking continuing medical education, you see here on the screen some of the instructions about that. You need to claim your credit before midnight. Don't put it off. And you may use event call-in, and you can call that toll-free number that you see on this slide, 210-888-8298. Or you can use the Clancy app if you have it on your cell phone to enter event ID number 279202. And you see it again on the screen as I'm speaking. Additionally, instructions were emailed to you earlier today. And if you still need assistance, please email us at humanities@uthcsa.edu and we'll help get it straightened out. Those of you who are seeking CEU credit for social workers and counselors also received an email with a survey link earlier today. Please do complete that survey and your CEUs will be sent to you later this week. If you did not receive that survey, do notify us at humanities@uthcsa.edu. And now it is my privilege to introduce our speaker, Dr. Rita Nakashima-Brock. Dr. Brock is Senior Vice President for Moral Injury Programs at Volunteers of America. She is also a commissioned minister of the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ. A native of Japan, Dr. Brock arrived in the United States at age 6. Raised in a military family, she earned her doctorate from Claremont Graduate University, becoming the first Asian American woman in the United States to earn a doctorate in theology. Dr. Brock directed the Radcliffe Fellowship Program at Harvard University. She was also a fellow at the Harvard Divinity School Center for Values in Public Life, as well as a visiting scholar at the Starr King School for the Ministry in Berkeley. In 2002, she co-founded the Soul Repair Center at Texas Christian University's Bright Divinity School, directing it for 5 years. Her most recent book is Soul Repair, Recovering from Moral Injury After War, co-authored with Gabriella Latini. Please welcome Dr. Brock. Please know that she's been with us all day today. She gave a wonderful, lengthy workshop midday today about what makes us moral, morality, trauma, and moral injury. And now she's going to shift slightly the focus to moral injury and its challenges to current mental health models. Dr. Brock.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be with all of you. I'm assuming some of you are people I might know since I was in Texas for a while, but since this is online and you may be from somewhere else. But for those of you that I know, thank you for being here. And for those of you that I don't know, welcome. And I hope you find this talk helpful. And just a little background on myself for those of you who don't know me. It may be a little puzzling why someone who's a theologian has become a subject matter expert in moral injury. A part of that has to do with my ongoing interest in psychology and science, which I actually entered college as a pre-med major with the intention of becoming a neurosurgeon. But I got waylaid by the civil rights movement and religion began to fascinate me more. But I've always had this other interest in science. And I also minored in psychology in college and then also in graduate work did a lot of work in psychology. So I'm not completely uninformed about what mental health is and what their mental health professionals write about moral injury. And I also have a very personal interest in the topic of moral injury because I grew up in a military family and the stepfather who raised me was a veteran of Normandy. He was in the 1st Infantry at Normandy. That was his first military assignment when he enlisted during World War II at the age of 19. And then he was discharged, medically discharged after World War II, recovered and went back into the military where he met my mother in Japan. That's how they got together. But he then served 2 tours late in his career. In fact, it ended his military career. He left the military after he did 2 tours in Vietnam and now I know he had a serious case of moral injury at the time as his daughter who was just going off to college. He just was so different and unpleasant to be around that I stopped going home very much just because I didn't want to be around him. And then he died 8 years later of a heart attack. So I've lived in a state of sort of disconnection from him for a lot of my adult life, and discovering moral injury has really changed my relationship to him and my family. So it matters to me. And I also have some knowledge of what it does to families. So that's the sense of the work I'm doing. I'm going to use a PowerPoint. So I'm going to do the screen sharing process on Zoom here so that you can see the PowerPoint. And I'm hoping this has worked. Yes. You can see it, right? Okay, good. I'm gonna, because it's evening and I know a lot of you may be tired at the end of your workday, I thought I'd start with some stories to set a context for what I'm gonna be talking about in relation to this thing called the mental health model. This is Mac Bika, Camillo Mac Bika, who's someone I know, and we wrote about him in our book, Soul Repair. So those of you who read that book may remember some of his story. He grew up in an Italian immigrant family in Brooklyn. His parents were from Sicily. His father had served in World War II as a translator for the US military back in his hometown in Sicily, and watched many of his neighbors be killed, and came home and dealt with that by having a group of Italian military veterans who played cards regularly at Mac's house. And so Mac loved hiding behind the couch and listening to them tell their war stories with each other and process that war. And he was fascinated and also aware of how devastating war could be. But when he went off to college, he signed up for an ROTC program because he's not a pacifist, and he had thoughts about serving his country in the military. But by the time he was finishing college, he was intent on becoming a school teacher, which gave him a deferment. And he was considering taking the deferment. He had a fiance. He was trying to figure this out. But one of his best friends, Ralphie, had been killed in Vietnam. And it made him feel terrible that so many of his generation were going off to Vietnam and dying, and that he was going to sit the war out. And so he enlisted, and he was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the US Marine Corps, and spent 13 months in Vietnam. And this is he kept a journal. He did a lot of writing when he was in Vietnam, and he kept a journal, and he wrote poetry as well. And this is a poem he read at the Truth Commission on Conscience in War, while he was in Vietnam. It's an excerpt from the entire poem, but he says, and the title of the poem is Tai Chi Chuan, which is the warrior's dance. I fear I am no longer alien to this horror. I am the horror. I have lost my humanity and have embraced the insanity of war. The monster and I are one. The blood of innocence forever stains my soul. The transformation is complete, and I can never return. Mea culpa, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. While Mac was in Vietnam, his 81-year-old grandmother walked to church barefoot in all seasons to pray for the life of her grandson. And so he came home, but as he says, I didn't really come home. The person that came home wasn't the person who left. But he tried to make a life. He married his fiancée, but that marriage fell apart within 5 years. He admits he was terrible to live with at the time. He was just in so much inner turmoil about the war. And he went to the VA for help. So he got a therapist, and the therapist tried to persuade him by asking him about such questions, that his parents had done a bad job of raising him as a child. Was in an era when people thought toilet training and things like that determined your character in adult life. And so he was furious. He just was so angry that they weren't listening to him, and that they would try to blame his good parents who raised a good Catholic boy who came home from the war an atheist, that somehow it was their doing, that he was so, as it were, messed up in his mind. So he finally just gave up on the VA and wound up hiking the Appalachian Trail for 6 years, smoking weed with his dog, and smoking weed is what he says. It took him 6 years of that kind of solitary walking, hiking, being with his dog, to finally come back, to go home again and struggle to rebuild a life. And so he went back to the VA, and he met a good clinician who was supportive of him. And what he wanted to do was to form veteran-led groups, because he hadn't found the therapeutic process at all helpful. And so they began, he was at the Brooklyn VA, and they actually hired him to run these groups for veterans. And he said there were lots of times when he talked guys off of roofs of ledges of buildings, or had guns in their hands. He did a lot of suicide prevention work, and people were calling him. But it was a program that was, I would say, his ministry as an atheist to other veterans to try to save their lives and help them come back as well. And he eventually did go to graduate school and get a doctorate. And in 1990, he became a professor at the New York School of Visual Arts, and has been there ever since, is still there. And he's a philosopher of war and morality and healing. That's his vocation. And he's done 3 books he calls the War Legacy series. You can see the covers there. But he also just spends a lot of time with other veterans, talking about moral injury, working with them. He's a leader in Veterans for Peace. And so he was able to grapple with his moral injury to the point that he was able to build a successful life. But it was no easy journey for him. It took a very long time. And he remains skeptical of some of the mental health models that are trying to help veterans, partly because he does not believe, number one, that his parents were the reason he suffered so much. He thought the war was pretty bad in and of itself. And that what happened to him and how he came home didn't make him pathological. It wasn't a disorder. He was just miserable and suffering because he'd done what he was asked to do, and it was an awful thing he was asked to do. So he speaks a lot on moral injury these days, and continues to support veterans' work. And this is the two book covers from Jonathan Shay. Jonathan Shay is the first person that we know of to use the term moral injury. And he used it in his book, Achilles in Vietnam. He is not a military veteran. In fact, he was working as a neuroscientist studying the effect of stroke on the brain. He's a psychiatrist and comes from a medical family. His father was also a doctor. And then in his 40s, he had a stroke, a very bad stroke, and it ended his neuroscience career. And as he said, the VA in Boston needed a psychiatrist for a sort of drop-in clinic for veterans of the Vietnam era. And so he was hired as a psychiatrist by the VA and worked in that drop-in center clinic for around 20 years with a team, including James Monroe, who and several others who were on this team of clinicians that worked there. And what he says is that he didn't know when he started that job that the veterans were going to steal his heart or give him his life's work. But that's what happened to him working with the veterans in this drop-in clinic who were suffering so much from the things that Mac had experienced, moral injury, PTSD, all kinds of things. And so this is what he says about, I'm trying to remove this pop-up thing that just came. Sorry, I'm gonna go back to that. Okay, he says, for years, I have agitated against the diagnostic jargon, post-traumatic stress disorder, because transparently, we are dealing with an injury, not an illness, malady, disease, sickness, or disorder. And through history, there have been a number of terms for this thing we are now sort of calling moral injury. And in Homer, where Jonathan saw parallels to his Vietnam veterans, it's called, there are terms that are used like agonia, agony, or orye, which is fury. So Jonathan actually wound up writing these books, not because he was an expert at all on Homer, but he was familiar with Homer, but because he, in the drop-in clinic, as he was looking at their files, he realized that they weren't doing good intake interviews with the veterans, so that people weren't really aware of what they'd gone through as they counseled them, and that the people needed more information on what they might have experienced that was causing them to suffer so much. And so he thought that maybe Achilles, the character of Achilles in Homer, actually was a good example of what someone could go through in a war that had bad leadership, but who was a distinguished warrior. And so he wrote a paper for the people in his clinic, a little concept paper, explaining that if they couldn't get good answers in their intake interviews from the veterans, or they weren't forthcoming, that they should just look at Achilles. That would help them understand what they'd been through. And her daughter, his daughter, was taking a class that semester with a leading international expert on Homer at Harvard University. And so she thought it would be interesting to see what he thought of it. And she gave him her dad's paper. And the professor was dumbstruck. He realized that no one had actually, even though it's a war epic, the Iliad is a war epic, it's a story of people in war, no one had thought to actually have living veterans' voices in relation to that epic that would illuminate both ways, that you could understand more about Achilles, but also understand what veterans today were going through. And so the professor urged him to write a book about it. And he wound up writing two, one on the Iliad and one on the Odyssey, because you have the war and then you have the homecoming. And he called what was happening to people like Achilles the undoing of character, which is moral injury. It's a change in someone's character. But other terms, you know, in Civil War, it was soldier's heart. In World War I, it was shell shock. And then we had battle fatigue. And finally, in 1980, we had PTSD that finally made it into the DSM. But he thinks that that's a little bit inadequate, the PTSD diagnosis. And so moral injury is the sort of proposed term for something else that's hard to get your mind around, but is clearly a source of profound suffering in military veterans. And war is one of the main factors for why. It's a chaotic situation. You go in there to do your job, you're well trained for it, you do what you're asked to do, you go home, you may get a medal for it, but at some point you may ask yourself, what human being celebrates killing other people? What is moral about that? And so moral injury can be something that someone doesn't experience for a very long time. It isn't necessarily happens right in the middle of things. You can have a delayed response, or you can be being treated for PTSD, which helps you get your memory back. And once you get your memory back and you have a coherent story of something that might have happened to you, you might start to feel pretty miserable about it rather than feel better that you can remember it. So Shay's definition for moral injury is that it's a betrayal of what's right by someone who holds legitimate authority, example in the military, a leader, an officer in the field or in the Pentagon, in a high stakes situation. So it's got three parts: betrayal, authority, and high stakes. And all three have to be present. So what I've noticed about this definition he offers, this is a summary he wrote in 2014 to summarize what's in the book Achilles in Vietnam, is that Achilles in Vietnam doesn't lay down this clean definition of moral injury. What it does instead is tell you what it is by Achilles' behavior. And that is that change of character and a suffering so severe that it can change the character of a healthy, idealistic, purposeful, high-functioning adult. And that change has lifelong consequences. In Achilles' case, it was death. It's not a minor thing to experience moral injury. War isn't the only cause of it. I've talked to veterans who didn't serve even out of the side of the country, and yet were in circumstances that gave them a pretty serious case of moral injury. And if I have time, I'll tell you the story of a B-52 bomber pilot who was like that. But Shay argues that PTSD is also not a pathology, not a sickness. It's the persistence of adaptive behaviors needed to survive in a stressful environment. For example, emotional numbing is useful in a disaster situation and maladaptive in a family setting. And a loss of trust enhances survival in a prison, but not in a community. So that what we call PTSD, as far as Shay is concerned, is it's a habitual form of behavior that has changed how you function in reality because of the context you've been in where you had to do that behavior to survive. It's like you learn high fear responses to things and then you can't turn those off. And so he argues against labeling with a diagnosis as a disorder. So he argues against labeling and a patronizing treatment of veterans, which most veterans deeply resent. And so what does he mean by labeling and patronizing? Well, mental health has moved in what I would call a medicalized model, where you have to have a diagnosis to treat and to be paid for treating. So diagnosis to treat, bill for services. One party in a mental health model listens, evaluates, observes, offers observations, directions, and sometimes drugs, while the other party makes themselves emotionally vulnerable, shares distress and secrets in search of healing, and pays or others pay but on their behalf. The party seeking healing often lacks the resources or skills to evaluate their therapist for suitability. And suitability may relate to race, gender, or other identity or cultural factors, or even religious faith, or to assess success rates. So it's sort of, you just hope for the best when you're going often into those, a person goes in for therapy. It's a very complicated process. It's episodic, like an hour. It's a limited time process that is removed from the context of meaningful, enduring relationships. It's a transactional relationship that cannot continue beyond the time of treatment. So those are all ways in which the mental health model we currently have can work against or not be all that helpful for addressing moral injury. That is not to say that it isn't helpful for people who have mental health issues. So I'm not arguing that we should get rid of it or it's a bad model. I'm just saying that from the perspective of veterans and Shay, the way it works can be counterproductive. Because Shay thinks that really what people with moral injury need is to be re-socialized, to actually be in a social context where people care about them and keep working with them as a means of promoting socially acceptable behavior patterns. So they can unlearn the habits that have gotten them in a miserable state and begin to process by talking to other people about their moral injuries. So when trauma survivors, he says, hear that the truth of their experience has been understood, remembered, and retold with enough fidelity to carry some of their truth, then the circle of communalization is complete. And I think this is interesting for Shay to be saying this because he is a psychiatrist. He's trained to be a mental health specialist. And he has come to sort of conclusion that something else is needed. And then Brett Litz and a whole team of clinicians proposed an additional definition of moral injury in 2009 in an essay that's now become a classic. It's sort of the essay that started this whole new area, last 10 years of a firestorm of work on moral injury, which I was lucky enough to get into by receiving a copy of this essay before it was published. And my head exploded. I said, oh my God, this is so important. This is like really important. So their definition in 2009 was it's perpetrating, failing to prevent, bearing witness to, or learning about acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. This may entail participating in or witnessing inhumane or cruel actions, failing to prevent the immoral acts of others, as well as engaging in subtle acts or experiencing reactions that, upon reflection, transgress a moral code that severely and abruptly contradicts an individual's personal or shared expectation about the rules or the code of conduct. The individual also must be or become aware of the discrepancy between her or his or her own morals and the experience, i.e., the moral violation, causing dissonance and inner conflict. And that inner conflict piece is a profound emotional pain, because our ethics and our morality aren't just abstract ideas. They're how we live our lives in relation to love and care and all the things that matter most to us. And that has huge emotional content. And if you can't make moral sense out of your universe and your conscience is saying it's not right, there's intense emotional inner conflict. This is a paraphrase of another way they describe it in a book that Litz organized with some of the same members of the original team, that moral injury is a syndrome of shame, self-handicapping, anger, and demoralization that occurs when deeply held beliefs and expectations about moral and ethical conduct are transgressed. It is distinct from a life threat, as it is also not inherently fear-based. It can arise from killing, perpetration of violence, betrayals of trust in leaders, witnessing depraved behavior, or failing to prevent serious unethical acts. And what I found interesting about the Brett Litz essay and the book that this is paraphrases from, called Adaptive Disclosure, is that they actually propose an 8-step protocol, a kind of way of helping someone process moral injury, which includes an imagined conversation with a benevolent moral authority, which I thought was interesting, since I'm a minister and I'm thinking, well, I don't have to be imaginary. I could have a conversation with someone. But what they conclude, even after they describe this protocol, is they say it's not enough. Talking to a therapist, being in therapy, it is not enough. That communities have to become engaged in supporting people who are struggling with moral injury, because they need to be resocialized. They need to feel valuable to other people. They need to feel like their lives aren't just in the toilet, and that other people care about them and value them as members of their communities. And so even the clinicians at the VA who've worked on moral injury the most are saying what they can do is only partial. It can help, especially if somebody's in an acute crisis. Of course, seeing somebody to talk to can be really helpful. But the long-term recovery from moral injury takes a lifetime. And it takes new relationships in someone's life that make them feel like life is still worth living. So the emotions that they talk about in that essay are, in positive psychology, are called moral emotions. And there are positive moral emotions like joy and happiness, and create the creativity, curiosity, wonder. There are lots of emotions, and the moral ones that are positive are great. We love having those emotions, but there's a difficult side to moral emotions when things aren't going well that become inside us extremely painful. And yet they're also oddly, paradoxically, pro-social emotions, because morality has to do with our relationships. And when our relationship to reality is beginning to fail, we have these difficult moral responses. So they cluster around outrage, anger, fury, disgust, contempt, revenge, frustration. These are often externalized as forms of anger or behaviors toward other people that are not helpful. And then there are the ones that sort of turn inward and you beat yourself up. And so you have guilt, shame, embarrassment, humiliation, alienation, and self-condemnation. And then underneath both systems of moral emotions, I think, are sorrow and remorse. Sorrow especially is important to pay attention to. A friend of mine who was a Navy Reserve chaplain for a while and is an expert on moral injury, and when he deployed as a chaplain, he was in Camp Pendleton with the Marine Corps. And he says, one of the things you need to understand about military folks and veterans is that, especially for men, sorrow is not a male emotion. Grief is a sign of a kind of weakness or not regarded positively. But anger is okay. And so he said a lot of times when people are really grieving, they will present as angry. And my friend who works in San Quentin with people in for life sentences around the same issues around moral injury and moral emotions says that anger is actually a secondary emotion, and underneath it is often sorrow or frustration or humiliation. So it's important to note that outrage, berserk anger is what Jonathan Shay calls the response to betrayal. That underneath that is a whole lot of other stuff, and moral injury is just very complicated that way. So here's another analogy for what I think are some of the problems with the medicalized model, because a medicalized model requires a diagnosis that's based in a guidebook that has these diagnoses, and they apply to everybody. So there's an individual. It's a model for individuals that is a sort of one size fits all, if they fit, model of treating someone with a mental health issue, and it sort of doesn't see people in complex ways as maybe that diagnosis is it fits, but it might not actually be appropriate, or any of those sorts of complex things. And it's sort of the difference between a monocrop forest where you're farming trees for lumber and this picture of a forest in Morocco that's been there about 800 years that supports 26 villages around it as a food forest. And they know the human beings have been, over those 800 years, trying out different things that might grow in that forest that is a food supply, and that all these different things ripen at different points. And really all they have to do is, if it grows there, they just go in and harvest when it's ripe. And so a food forest has this amazing complexity. There's lots of things growing in there. Things grow year round that are a food source. And the way everything interacts sustains the life of the forest. It doesn't need fertilizer because it has bugs and rotting logs and other things. Doesn't need anything except sunshine and water. And that forest has worked for 800 years in that place in Morocco. When moral injury, I think of moral injury as a fire that comes through the forest. And when you have a mono, like everything is the same, you don't have any resiliency. And the use of single tree type forests began in the 19th century with a German scientist named Beckmann, who realized that you could get a much better timber yield, a lot more, if you only planted one set of trees in rows and cleaned out the undergrowth, so that you could come in after 80 years and harvest a bunch of really big trees. And if you just plotted these places in sequence like that, you could just have a continual harvest of trees. And he convinced the entire world to do this. So this mono tree culture of forestry has been all over the planet. And the limits of it are that this is a Thomas fire in California from 2 years ago. Now we have similar terrible fires happening. This was one of the largest avocado orchards in the world. And the fire was so hot that it melted the plastic irrigation tubing in the ground and killed everything for about a foot down. And so there's no resiliency there. They're just going to have to take everything out and start over, because nothing will grow back there. The Donald Fire, which happened around the same time, happened in the Sierra Forest in Northern California. And it's an ecology that's sort of designed to have fires occasionally, not all that often, but often the biggest trees can survive a forest fire. And you can already see there's some green underneath growth, and things are sort of starting to come back in that fire. And that avocado orchard will never come back like that. So there's, when you have moral injury and you sort of treat it as a monolithic thing, you don't have the opportunity to see where organically people might be able to find ways to come back from something as devastating as moral injury. So one of the policies of our Shay Moral Injury Center at Volunteers of America is that we're working with moral injury in terms of peer support models. We use clinicians as backup to support our facilitators who facilitate the groups who are peer support. But we trust the peer support facilitators to be able to administer the program as a process of recovery from moral injury. And so this is a group of some of our facilitators and veterans who've been through it, plus some guests who were there to hear them speak. And we found some success with that. And the reason we use a peer support model is, the first thing is it lowers the bar for trust. When you're in a group with somebody you know would understand what you've been through, you're more likely to trust them with what you've been through. It also removes the stigma of having a professional in the room. Nobody's diagnosing, nobody's observing, everybody's a participant, including the peer facilitators who also participate as group members in the groups they facilitate. It also enables the participants to have some say in their own well-being and make a contribution to others. We give them the choice to share as much as they're comfortable sharing, and Generally, there will be one or two people who share quite a lot, and that will inspire other people to share, but it's no pressure. It's kind of a reaction that happens in a group. Once somebody is brave enough to get real, everybody gets real. And also a peer support system creates a community of resocialization. They resocialize each other by practicing behaviors that are helpful to them. It also is a way that the sufferer's truth is validated by people who are not going to judge it, but take it in and believe it. And it also enables the wisdom of the group to benefit an individual. If an individual is really struggling, the group will often work really hard to support them and help them figure something out. And there's a kind of credibility of the caring in the room. One of our veterans who went through the program said, you know, nobody here is getting anything. They're not getting paid. They're not getting something for caring about me. And they said things to me like, well, you know, you're really smart, and you're a man, and you're really wise. And he said, no one had ever said those things to me before. And I think it meant something to him that they weren't trying to make him feel better because it was their job. It was just an honest assessment that he felt he received from them. And it meant a lot to them. He said, afterwards, he said, I felt worthy, which I thought was an interesting choice of words. So I'm going to talk a little bit, and then I'm going to leave us time for questions. Say a little bit about the kind of community and congregational and cross cooperation between clinicians and religious communities that could happen that would help people struggling with moral injury, partly because it's not just veterans. I think moral injury is so much more common in the culture than we've paid attention to, that it makes communities and congregations and places stronger for having ways to help people process them. Often when you have a dysfunctional community and people aren't getting along and they're fighting a lot, it's because there's something underneath that they need to process. So offering the kind of welcome that is open-hearted and accepting and gives, for veterans, having an opportunity to serve others is actually really important. They don't come to receive things, they also want to serve. That's part of the ethos they learn in the military. It's why a lot of them even enlisted. And congregations often need help with all kinds of things. And so there are ways to not just to offer them a chance to be supported, but also for them to be respected, contributing members of the community. That's part of the resocialization. And then there's the teaching people to do deep listening. That's generally not the normal way we have conversations, but if you're carrying something that's hard to share, having somebody really intently listen to you is such a gift. So to create safe gathering places for people to do that is important. Focusing attention through spiritual practices to create inner awareness. Mindfulness breathing is one, Tai Chi, yoga, prayer. There are these practices that help people quiet the thinking mind and get into their hearts. And then creativity. The arts are so important for helping people keep their spirits up when they're struggling with difficult things. So there's lots of joy in singing and all kinds of other art activities that can be really helpful to people who are struggling with moral injury. Book groups there's so many books that address moral injury, talk about it. So that's another thing that you could do. And writing groups are popular with veterans. A friend of mine has run a poetry writing group out of the Kansas City Public Library for veterans on moral, and it's not moral injury focused, but a lot of it is about processing moral injury. And they help them with poetry instructors. They try to take them seriously as poets, and that really helps them grapple with their poetry. And then offering holistic health practices. So much of moral injury impacts physical health as well. And so teaching people self-care for their physical health, spiritual disciplines, time to reflect, and all of those sorts of practices is also helpful, but it's something we all need. We don't want to, the one thing I think you don't want to do, especially with veterans, is treat them as a special needs population. They don't feel like they are, and they have a sense of dignity and don't want to be regarded that way. And then there are, I think, a lot of ways that clinicians and clergy or chaplains can collaborate on helpful work on moral injury, including creating processes for lamentation, and liminal spaces, ritual spaces that help people transition from military to civilian identity through a sort of worship or ritual space. My friend Herm Kaiser, who was a military chaplain, said his church in Grand Rapids had a tradition for veterans who were leaving the military, where the veteran would come in their military uniform and stand in front of the congregation, and they would be thanked for wanting to serve their country, and their military record would be read, or their whatever medals they might have and how long they served and where. And after that happened, then they would go off, and something would happen during the service, and they would come back in civilian clothing. So they would actually physically change their clothes, and they would come back and stand in front of the community, and then the community would embrace them and welcome them back as part of who they were. And he said it was deeply moving for a lot of the veterans to just be given that formal sense that they have made this transition, and now they're a civilian, and now they're going to have to be back in the community and learn to be a civilian again. And so it places the person's individual identity back into a larger community where they matter. And again, the arts are another way that clinicians and religious organizations and chaplains can cooperate. There's a wonderful art program called Arts and Healing at the UCLA School of Arts. At their medical, they have an Arts and Healing program attached to their medical school, and they offer free webinars and all kinds of things on how to use the arts in a context of helping people. And then there are the spiritual practices that I talked about, like meditation and mindfulness breathing. And the other thing about rituals is they help people repeat over and over behaviors that enact their highest values. And it reminds them of their humanity, and restores their sense of connection to other people who also aspire to those values. So they're very important. And then public recognition for the service work they're doing, for their way that they feel valuable to the communities that they're in, is also really important. I want to go back to the issue around aspirational values and ritual and holding humanity, because my friend Herm Kaiser was a chaplain in Vietnam. That was the first, his deployment was to Vietnam, and he, when he first got there, he was staging with his unit, and they were getting in trucks and getting ready to go deploy someplace. And so he thought, well, this is going to be dicey. They're going off to battle. Maybe I should offer communion. And so he has a little communion kit, and he went to the first truck, and the guys were in the back, and he said, would you like to have communion? And or he said, have you had communion? And they all looked at him and said, no. And he said, no. And they said, no, we've never had communion. He said, well, would you like it? They said, sure. So he served communion, did the formal little service of communion in the back of that truck. And he said, and a lot of the guys weren't even Christian, but they really wanted to have communion. And so they felt so much better after they had it, that they radioed down the truck line, and he had to do communion at every truck in the line because they all wanted it. And I think that his surmise is that it was something that wasn't the war, that wasn't the military, that was something else that was contained in that ritual that somehow lifted up their sense of being human beings, and that really mattered to them as they were scared and getting ready to go off and do something that they might die in. And so there's that kind of value to these odd moments in difficult situations, where you can create a moment when people remember their own humanity. That can be really important. So I'm just going to conclude by saying moral injury is not something that comes immediately necessarily in relation to events or experiences. It can come years later. So you never know when it's going to surface, but it can. And it's a little unpredictable that way. and people will try to avoid the pain of it, so they may delay trying to pay attention to it. It's an aspect of many high-stakes situations and traumas, including natural disasters and work that has high stakes, and you can, and so making a mistake or doing the wrong thing can be devastating. Even if you didn't mean to do harm, it can feel devastating. It's also you can have a life condition that limits your options, so you don't have a good choice. And then you'll feel like a miserable person because you had to do something that you didn't want to do. Moral injury also creates mistrust and isolation in people. So if people are not, if you see a change in character where people are not engaging with other people, that's a place you might want to ask the person how they're doing. And of course, it can interact with PTSD and adverse childhood experiences and traumatic brain injury as well. So it can be quite complicated trying to address it. And it can emerge as a secondary trauma in caregivers. We are empathetic human beings, and we can hear things that are so devastating, we feel like witnesses to it, and it wrecks our sense of morality. So even if you weren't there, if you hear about something, it can be a devastating thing. So this is just a quote from the Navy Reserve chaplain, who's now a professor of pastoral theology at Chicago Theological Seminary, Zachary Moon. He says, as moral injury takes its place in the common parlance, we need to ask what it provides our consciousness and what it limits, and how we could more fully address the human experience of moral suffering. So I'm going to pause there and see what you've been saying in chat, and have a conversation with, well, I guess it's not a conversation, but I want to hear what you're saying or thinking or have questions about.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brock. I don't know where the time went. I feel like we're just getting started. Honestly, I really do. If you don't mind, a couple of points. People are still wanting to get some particulars. If you want the handout and you didn't get it in your email, Dr. Brock kindly provided us with a handout that has almost all the information from the slides. The slides themselves are too big to be shared, too big a file, but you can email us at humanities@uthcsa.edu, and we will be happy to send you a copy of that wonderful handout.
Yeah, it includes the entire workshop from this afternoon as well, so you get a little extra.
There you go. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Yeah.
Also, this session and the midday session were both recorded, and a video recording is going to be available afterwards. So I hope that addresses most of your concerns, and we've now answered a lot of the questions about continuing education in the chat and the questions. So I would like to go to a question that was submitted by Dr. Lisa Ochoa. Dr. Brock, Lisa Ochoa is a young vascular surgeon in our community who has deliberately planted her practice in zip codes that are particularly disadvantaged. And as a vascular surgeon, she is seeing the devastating consequences of inequality in our community, where people of color, underrepresented minorities, and particularly the Latinx community are undergoing amputations of limbs at a far higher rate than the rest of Texas and the rest of the country because of their untended diabetes. And Dr. Ochoa asks this question. She said, in your slide, you noted that shell shock, battle fatigue, and PTSD are other words for moral injury. Can you comment on how physician burnout may be similarly misunderstood? Perhaps our physicians working in a challenging healthcare system, and I gave you the background to give you a little insight into Dr. Ochoa's particular challenges. And now she broadens it to all of us who are battling the pandemic. Do we have moral injury, and are we not just burned out? Could you comment on those?
Yes, that's a great question. There's an essay that will be shortly published. It's not out yet, but it's in my bibliography in the handout as a forthcoming essay by a team that has created a moral injury symptom scale for healthcare. And they've tested it in China and in North Carolina during COVID, and have demonstrated that it works and that there is a high moral injury rate in medical caregivers during this pandemic. And it actually confirms what a lot of us suspected, is that COVID has created, it's like a natural disaster hitting. It's created chaotic conditions with things out of control and not enough of anything to do the job that physicians were trained to do. And so it's my friend who was a surgeon in Vietnam. He was a battlefield surgeon in Vietnam. He's a retired doctor himself. He thinks that COVID situation is so close to what he experienced in the battlefields of Vietnam that if people don't have moral injury, it will be a miracle. Because especially early on, when there weren't enough ventilators and PPE, and people were scrambling and the virus was puzzling and they couldn't figure out what to do about it. He said, you know, people were having to do triage work. They were actually having to decide who would live and who would die. And they had to do it in a battlefield. It's the same thing. You don't have time to have a committee make a decision. You just have to decide then this person is going to get care, this person isn't. And so that's it. And you do that, you have to, it's in front of you, you have to make those choices and decisions. But afterward, it can be devastating that you had to do that. And maybe you made the wrong, maybe you chose that would do better and they died anyway also. So those are some of the outcomes that people were facing. And then I have a friend who's a chaplain with the New York Fire Department, and she was telling me about how they were receiving 8 to 10 times higher numbers of calls every shift, of course, for ambulance help. And so these units were rushing to places to help, you know, they go in to take somebody to the hospital, they go in to save a life. And they were showing up at places where people had already died. So they were calling mortuary. I mean, they were actually not able to save people, or they would get somebody into an ambulance and then they would be in a long line of ambulances in front of an ER trying to unload, and the person would die in the ambulance. And one EMT at the end of April in New York, who had just started his job and been doing it for 3 months, got so discouraged by the end of April, he took his own life. And he was not somebody who had had any history of depression. His dad had been a cop. He was really excited about being an EMT. He was going to save lives, and he was really happy to be one. And then 3 months later, he was just too devastated to continue. So yes, it's a high risk time for lots of frontline workers who are dealing in these high stakes situations. I think there's an extra load of worry that's not true on the battlefield, because when you're on the battlefield, your own safety is at risk. So you know you might die, but your family isn't at risk. They're home safe. And here with COVID, people are having to worry about not taking the disease home to their families. And even people are staying in hotels so as not to do that. So then they're isolated, and they're not even with a team of people in the military. They're just by themselves when they go back to their hotel rooms. And so it's been just a devastating time. So I do think that there's going to be a need for people who are developing moral injury programs for medical caregivers, and that it was already a problem before COVID. So I think there's a 2018 essay that said 48% of American nurses were considering leaving their profession. And they were calling it burnout. But I think when you walk away from something you trained that you wanted to do, that's a serious change in character. It's not just fatigue. It's not just burnout is like, well, if you just work less and got a vacation, you'd be all right. And moral injury, you're not all right, even if you do those things. And there were articles on stop calling it burnout, call it moral injury, because a lot of physicians there was a higher suicide rate, and people were leaving the profession already before COVID because they the managed care system was preventing them from delivering the best medicine they thought that their patients deserved, and they couldn't do it because it wouldn't be paid for. And so and that's a kind of wearing you down that can happen eventually, and you can break. And right now we're working on an online program. We have an hour-long online group peer facilitated, two peer facilitators in groups of 6, who we give people an opportunity who are working on frontline work to just be with other people who understand what they're going through, so they can just share the stress, just talk about it in a safe place, safe and confidential place. Because I think if you don't get a chance to do that as you're going, it just builds and builds and builds. And that's when you can break. You can get very brittle because you're holding down so much inner emotional turmoil around what's happening, and not getting a chance to debrief it. And it's funny how if you examine those feelings, they're a lot less intense, and you can work with them after you've actually looked at them and shared them with someone. So yes, it's a serious issue, and I'm glad you asked the question. And I think the other there's a lot of moral distress in the society around what COVID has exposed about racism, and the disproportionate death rates and infection rates in poorer and communities of color, who also often have higher complicating illness factors that are stress induced just from being in a racist society. So that's I think a lot of it's been surprising to me how many people feel now distress about that, especially with the murder of George Floyd, exposing one kind of racist violence that everybody. But there have been stories, but somehow that pivoted people's attention on it in a way that nothing else has in a long time. So there's a high level already in the society of moral distress, I think, and I think in the frontline workers, it's even more. And we ought to care about that, and we ought to be doing something about it.
Thank you. I want to ask you a quick question and then a more complicated question. Someone asked, please repeat the name of the author on the first page in your opening slides, the Italian man who was in Vietnam, whose name was not in the bibliography, she says.
Sorry. Yes. Oh, yeah. I forgot to put him in the bibliography. Bica, B-I-C-A, is his last name, and his first name is Camillo with 2 L's.
Okay, thank you. And here's a question that's a little bit more complex than the last one. If part of the triad of moral injury is betrayal by those in authority, for instance, military leadership, if it's a war type situation, what is the philosophical or practical role of those who were in authority in addressing the consequences of that injury? I guess, is there a moral ought?
I think there is, and there, General McMaster wrote his dissertation on the moral collapse of the military leadership in Vietnam, and so there's been a lot of work done on what happened to leadership in Vietnam, because it went very badly. It was bad enough that at the top people knew it was a bad war and we shouldn't have been there, and they lied about that for years, and just kept prosecuting a war we should never have been in. And McNamara finally said that in his memoirs long after all those people had died. But there was that chain of command, and all the way down to the lieutenant level. As Herm said, you got people who you don't advance in the military unless you've been in a war. That's a really good way to get a promotion. And so people would, as he said, go for 6 months, get their ticket punch and get their promotion and get out. Whereas the foot soldiers, the NCOs, were there for a long time, a lot longer. They often were better in the battlefield than those lieutenants who knew nothing. And so even the relationship between the field officers and the NCOs began to break down. And so we had people assassinating their leaders. It was called fragging, because they would put a fragmentation grenade in their tent or something and blow up so it was serious. It was a serious breakdown in authority that happened in Vietnam. It was devastating for the military. And Jonathan Shay was actually hired by the Marine Corps, and he's taught at the War College and other places around this betrayal issue. That he is fierce about moral leadership, and training people to be moral leaders. It doesn't mean they don't make mistakes. But to be moral leaders, you have to, it takes more than just wanting to get a promotion by going to a war. I actually had a friend in college, a Japanese American good friend who, and I was an anti-war activist in college. Nobody wanted to go. I was with all those peace activists who were like angry about the Vietnam War. And as a Japanese American, he felt he had to go. And so he enlisted and was started out as second lieutenant, wound up a company commander in his time there. But he went to our philosophy. We had a philosophy professor who was very popular and taught a lot of classes. And he went to talk to him and to tell him he'd enlisted. And the philosophy professor said to him, "I know I'm not going to persuade you not to go. You have to do this. The one thing I want you to do is to make sure you take care of your men." And so he made it his task with every unit he commanded to know every person's name and something about their family and where they were from, so that he would know each person personally. And the one memory that makes him cry every time he tells it was a thing that happened in a firefight. Obviously, he was a skilled officer. He came through it and got promoted, but he stayed there a long time. But he said he was in a terrible firefight, and he was giving commands automatically just from what he knew to do. And so he was yelling, "Go here, go there." And he saw one of his favorite kids take a gut shot, and he knew the kid would die. It was just a terrible gut shot. And he said, "I saw it out of the corner of my eye. But I had to keep focusing on where everybody was and telling them what to do. This was a terrible firefight." And he said, "And the next time I looked over there, I saw the corpsman holding this guy, sitting with him, holding him in his arms, singing to him." And every time he tells that story, he cries. And I think it's because in the middle of all this inhuman, horrible violence, there was this moment of humanity. Just this moment when being a human being was blessed, and this man didn't die alone. He died while somebody was singing to him.
In my own experience, I've been struck, Hurricane Katrina, Haiti earthquake, how often singing becomes critically important. And it's something that you don't have to be trained to do or go to a workshop about. You see it. It happens organically. It happens in different cultures and in different kinds of settings. It is a powerful expression of our humanity. And that was a really compelling moment that you shared with us. I want to try to get to some of the additional questions because we have a lot of good ones. We really do.
Okay.
I do want to ask this one about peer groups. Fascinated by the concept of peer groups, especially when we consider how underserved the whole area of mental health is. I think in Texas, we are maybe even especially profoundly underserved with mental health professionals. And this seems like a natural way to leverage and get more help to more people in a very practical way. So here's the question that somebody sent in. They say, "You shared earlier today and tonight about the peer groups being for the veteran and the impact that it has on the family, but there was no mention of them being influenced. I wonder if they mean the family. I'm not sure. As a marriage and family therapist," the questioner says, "I work with families and couples, so it would be interesting to hear how it can be incorporated." I think I'm taking this to mean the impact of the peer group participation, not just on the participant with the moral injury, but on the family circle surrounding. Is that something?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. We didn't do this for families, but I think you could. I know a woman named Lisa Dunster in Ohio who's she's a high school English. I think it's high school. She teaches English. She's a really good writer. She runs a thing called Compass Retreat, where she brings veterans up with their families, and they do all kinds of activities over a weekend, including giving the veterans themselves a chance to talk about moral injury. So people do, and she's a veteran herself. She was in the National Guard. So she runs those. So I would call that a peer run program. I don't know how they do their facilitation or anything, but she's been doing that for a number of years. There's lots of ways to do peer support. There's not just one way. We use peers, loosely defined. We're not real strict about that, but somebody who would understand the kind of things that a particular cultural group are experiencing. And they work in teams. They co-facilitate. So they back each other up, and if they, if somebody in the group has a meltdown, one of them can work with that person while the other person keeps the group going. So there's lots of reasons to have them paired up. They also can trade notes with each other about, well, what do you think was, why this? And they often develop really close friendships working together as co-facilitators. It's a lot less difficult our program for veterans is almost 60 hours long, and I don't think one person should be asked to do all of that facilitation by themselves. But we always, at the end of every day, debrief them, let them unload what they need to unload, and ask them what they're doing for self-care that night, so they're taking care of themselves. Yeah.
Back to the physicians, I'm also still thinking about the peer groups. Is there, as the Shay Center developed a facilitator training for physicians who may want to facilitate peer groups?
Well, we do have a facilitator training for people who work in healthcare. It's not just physicians, it's nurses and chaplains as well who work in healthcare. For this program we're calling REST, is Resilient Strength Time, which is just an hour long, and it's co-facilitated by 2 trained peer facilitators. So if you go to voa.org/rest, you'll find information about that program, and there's a place, if you're interested in being a facilitator, you can apply to be one. We're actually in the process of systematizing the facilitator training and getting one up and running pretty soon, because we're going to need some more. It's an interesting process. We've had some mocks. When we train people, we do a mock session and give them a chance to practice. And I didn't know whether it would work, and it's actually working rather well. At least the feedback from the facilitators is that. It's not a full-blown moral injury program. You can't do that in an hour, but you can help people deal with some moral distress they may be carrying that would help them to talk about.
Perhaps the pandemic would offer an opportunity to develop a full-blown moral injury program.
I worked with a woman in ethics in the nursing school at Johns Hopkins, and our research team at Texas Christian University for our program. The TCU, VOA, and Johns Hopkins applied for a major grant to set up moral injury programs, first online and then eventually in person, for medical personnel, but we didn't get the grant. So we're still looking. We got a good proposal, and we're now figuring out where else we could submit it.
Keep at it. I want to take another question. Here is a participant who says, as a Christian counselor and veteran, I see clients that definitely, all caps, may be suffering from moral injury. Does Dr. Brock have any resources that she would recommend for soul repair that don't necessarily pertain to combat? I think we've been discussing a few of them, but here's an opportunity to tell us more.
Yeah. There are actually a number of books in pastoral care and counseling that have been published on moral injury. So one of them, I didn't put these in the bibliography, but I could send a new version out to put them in. I was trying to focus on what I was talking about and not creating a bibliography that's enormous. But there's a book called Moral Injury. I think that's the main title of it, by a man named Larry Graham, Graham, Larry Graham. He's a he was a very senior pastoral theologian at Iliff School of Theology. And he was on a think tank team that we organized at the Soul Repair Center of pastoral theologians that we thought should become familiar with moral injury. And he jumped on it with both feet and wrote a whole book on it. And it's a very good book on moral injury, its dimensions and how to be pastoral and do pastoral care around it. And it's not just focused on veterans. It's focused in a larger sense. It's also sensitive to interfaith issues as well, but he's a Methodist. He's a Christian theologian. So there's that book. And then Carrie Doring, also at Iliff in Pastoral Theology, does a lot of work on moral distress and moral injury, the differences between the two and what self-care around moral distress entails. And she's published in several journals. And then Nancy Ramsey and she co-edited a book on spiritual care and military moral injury. But I think that a lot of that stuff applies to people beyond the military. So there are new resources coming out all the time, new books. It's exciting to see. I keep being asked to, like write a blurb or something for the back of a book, and so I get to see them, and it's really a rich, growing field right now. There also, if you're interested, there's a collection. It's not a very cheap book, but a really excellent collection called Moral Injury in Sacred Texts. So if you want to use biblical resources to help people look at moral injury, that's an excellent series of essays. There's a comparison of the characters of Peter and Paul in the New Testament by a New Testament scholar. A rabbi did a study of King David and Bathsheba and all of that. It's a major story. And another one did Lot and his daughters and his wife. So there's some really, I actually have concluded from doing this work that the entire Bible is a document about moral injury. It's just full of suffering, of people suffering in serious ways and doing bad things and then trying to make up for them, or it's a serious moral injury piece of work. And
very helpful.
Yeah.
Here's a question that brings us very focused to an issue that's important in South Texas, not only, but it's a South Texas issue for sure. This person says, in the earlier session, I saw another participant ask a question about moral injury as it pertains to witnessing and learning about ICE practices at the southern border. I would like to resubmit this question and add, what are your thoughts about moral injury in regards to police brutality, especially as it pertains to ER doctors who treat protesters who have received injuries from police? What can we do as healthcare professionals and as general civilians to engage with these events and avoid moral injury?
Wow. I don't know if you can avoid moral injury. I think it's just the chaos of life that hits. But there are things you can do with it. So I think that people who were outraged, morally outraged by the murder of George Floyd took to the streets in protest and made demands. I think that if you're an ER doctor and you're seeing those things, I think it's really important to be honest and truthful about how those injuries occurred. I've seen coroner reports about police shootings refute police deceptive, sort of self-defensive, protective stories about how that shooting occurred. I was involved in a case in Oakland where the coroner said the person was clearly shot lying down. And the policeman had said the guy had turned and tried to shoot at him and then run away, and he'd shot him in the back while he was running away, but he had been shot, according to the coroner, lying on the ground. So there are ways as medical professionals making sure that what you know about the truth of a killing is public in some way, is known by places that review these sorts of things. I think fixing this kind of police violence is going to take a really long time, because it's partly a cultural change in policing that's been happening since the 1960s. I remember when Los Angeles pioneered the SWAT team approach and heavily militarized police, just sort of the opposite of Andy Griffith and Mayberry, this sort of police, the sheriff that knows everybody and tries to make people get along. The policing has become a paramilitary occupation in a way that's changed how police regard the people that they're actually supposed to help. They start to see them as the enemy. And so I think it's a lot of work we have ahead of us to change that. But I think the people who are working on the front lines of seeing that happen it's a devastating kind of thing. The way you don't deepen into a moral injury crisis is when your conscience is violated like that. Be sure you have somebody you can talk to. Don't just isolate yourself and hold it in. Don't hold those feelings in. It's really, really important. And you may need a support group of people you work with. You may have a team that needs a debrief every shift to talk about how they're feeling about it. That can help a lot.
So here's a question: to ease the cognitive dissonance in moral injury recovery, in moral injury recovery, are we to focus more on rationalization, in parentheses, education on stress effects, or through distraction from the thought processes by engaging in those human aspects, or a combination of both?
So read that again at the beginning part.
I think there's first, it starts with an acknowledgement that moral injury by its definition, encompasses some cognitive dissonance.
Yes, of course it is. Yeah.
And then to what extent should we be very cerebral about it, with understanding in a cerebral way through education about what these stress effects are, and therefore what should we do about it? Or should we just be more human in our response to it and reach for our tools, like the singing episode?
Yeah, right.
Or is it a combination?
Yeah, I actually, with moral injury, I think the thinking process is secondary. It's later. Moral injury involves complex feelings, and they're painful feelings. And if there's not an opportunity to, as we call it in our program, sit in the fire with that pain, it will run everything that happens. So your thinking won't really process what's going on with the pain. Your thinking will be a way to squish it. And intellectualizing emotions is not a way to get rid of them. We all know that if you're in mental health at all, you can't think your way to sanity. You have to actually feel in an embodied way your way through all of those complex emotions. And I think you get greater clarity about thinking if you process those emotions first. Otherwise, it's a lot of often rationalization, and it won't hold up. I think that kind of thinking doesn't hold up.
Very helpful.
Yeah.
So we're back to veterans now with this question. It appears that the suicide rate for veterans has remained at about 22 or 23 per day. Wow. For a number of years. With new ways to address moral injury and significant increases to the VA, I guess in funding in this area, why does it appear that the suicide rate has not gone down, or has it? And can the church do more than individual counseling and group Bible study and prayer?
Yeah. I don't think the rate has gone down, if at all, because the national rate keeps rising. So it's not just veterans who are having suicide rates that are relatively high. Our civilian rate is also rather high, and it's been growing. The opioid crisis is part of that. There's that book, Deaths of Despair, where the one group that's seen a decline in longevity rates is white, and it's because of alcohol, drugs, and suicides. So there's a malaise in the country, I think, that's profoundly economic and moral. I think that when you're doing suicide prevention by having people call in when they're about to kill themselves, it's not a very effective process. And the reason that the Brett Litz team, I think, partly wrote their essay on moral injury is because treatments for PTSD have gotten better and better. There are ways to treat it, EMDR, eye movement therapy, exposure. There are lots of ways they try to help people with PTSD that are better than it used to be. And yet the suicide rates were still climbing in younger veterans.
And of course, we're now in an era where isolation is mandated for a different reason.
Yeah, and the worst thing for moral injury is to be isolated. So I think that those are all things that are going on right now that are factors. I'm working with a team from Duke, and we've had one phone call with the Manpower and Resilience Specialist at the Office of the Secretary of the Army. But we want the military to implement a 2-week boot camp out. We're calling it muster out for people who leave the military, that will give them that chance to be a little bit re-socialized, to process what they've experienced, and to make a transition that's not just informational. This is the problem with the current transition programs, is they give you a whole lot of information in a week, and they start at a year ahead, I guess, before you're leaving the military, and you fill out a questionnaire about your mental health and this, and then this, and then they have all the, but it's not, they don't actually give you an immersion process and processing and re-habituating you to civilian life. And so we think that a 2-week intensive process in a secure location away from the military would actually be the best prevention you could do for suicide. Your sound is off.
That possibly could be applied to people who've had very intense exposure to moral injury through intensive care unit or emergency room service during the COVID pandemic. It would be novel, and it's not something that's talked about. I'm watching the time. Actually, there's a clock right behind your head, Dr. Brock, which is right 1 minute away from 8:30. Before I let you give us your closing remarks, I wanted to tell our audience that we do have a third Conversations About Ethics this year. It will be on November 19th, so please watch your emails for an announcement. We're going to have a session moderated by my dear colleague, Mary Beth Fisk, regarding mental health and COVID-19. And we'll have another session that I will moderate that will look at ethical aspects of vaccine development and vaccine rollout for COVID-19. So that's a little bit more than a month away. So please keep an eye out for the next Conversations About Ethics. And Dr. Brock, did you have a few final closing remarks for us?
Yeah, one of the reasons I find moral injury so fascinating is that it's a linking term rather than a dividing term. And so I'm finding myself talking to psychiatrists and philosophers and artists and all kinds of people who have something to bring to the table around moral injury. And so it's a way we can all work together instead of trying to have our little turf and our expertise, that this is, like the sort of way that modern society divides things up into specialties and expertises, and never the twain shall meet. And moral injury really asks us to be more human and more connected to each other, and to work together around what we bring. And if it's hospitality we bring, if it's art we bring, if it's good facilitation we bring, if it's a way to help people reflect theologically, there are so many ways that people can actually help each other with moral injury, because I think a lot of us are carrying some of it around these days, that it's a linking term. And so that's the joy I find in it, in the midst of what the suffering of it is that there's something anyone can do.
Right, even including bearing witness to the sufferings of others. Those are wise and compelling words on which for us to end our evening. I want to thank you so much. I just regret that we're not able to take you for a nice Mexican meal here in San Antonio.
Check on that.
I hope that you will join us again when it becomes safe to do so, and that we will be able to give you a proper, warm South Texas welcome. And we hope to continue to learn from you. Indeed, you've given us many resources that we can access now through your writing and your books. So thank you so much. And our session is over. Thank you.
Bye.